wanted to wanted to go over some other books on liturgy or that liturgy or something. Also this other one, it's a thick one. It's by Cyril Halberon. It's called Eastern Christianity and Its Texts. It's got like different topics and stuff on it. Some of its contents. It's got an introduction. In the introduction section, it's got categories, scholasticism, tradition versus traditionalism, book structure, periodization, identities, and then another part called milestones. Got multiple sections from Quae Hall to Ecclesia, Romanitas versus Christianitas, Christianitas versus Romanitas, Christianity accommodates Rome, Rome accommodates Christianity, persecutions against the Greco-Roman religion, symphonies, critiques of symphony, monasticism, Eastern Christian fellowship, the wall, Russian modernity, national awakening and nationalism, Turkish genocides, isms, Eastern Christianity and communism, Orthodox theology in the 20th century, and in the second part called dialectics, and that has other sections like 3 words, knowledge of and about God, theological meta-languages, meta-linguistics, synthesis, Eastern logics, dialectical taxonomies, modern categories, and then the other third part, salvation. It has these sections in it called the fall, 2 paths, dynamics of virtue, synergy, sins and passions, spiritual battles, Jesus' prayer, hesychasm, theosis, and then the 4th part called the Trinity. Its sections are theologia, anaconomia, oneness and plurality, big questions, Christological blueprints, adoptionism and modalism, subordination, subordinalism, the Alexandrian controversy, the Nicene controversy, Cappadocian synthesis, and then the 5th section or 5th part. Its section is about Neo-Nicene Christology, Logos Anthropos, Logos Sarx, Proclus of Constantinople, Eutyches and Monophysitism, Ephesus II, the Chalcedon, Anti-Chalcedonian Resistance, Leontis of Byzantium, Anarchon, Neo-Chalcedonianism, Monoenergism, Monothelitism, Iconoclasm, and then the 6th part called the Church, and that has these sections in it. Extra Ecclesiam Nulla Salus, images of the Church, common and particular in the Church, nature and structures of the Church, Great Schisms, Unitism, era of confessionalism, Russian ecclesiology, era of ecumenism, Church and world. And then for the 7th part, and this part right has these sections called classical cosmogonies, Christian cosmogonies, creation in the image, structure of human nature, dualism, anti-dualism, freedom, human rights. So it's like a broad topic, right? Like 1 volume of politics and theology and all these other things, right? So it's a pretty interesting book. It deals with some poetry stuff as well, like how the church influenced the state, how the state influenced the church, and all that. that. Let me see. Like under symphony right, the idea of symphony right has to do with church and state right. It's like in this part, this is in this section, symphonies. It's just the idea of symphony. Although Eusebius envisaged the church as a part of the one godlike monarchy, the real role of the church sometimes resembled the role of the Roman Senate had played in the heydays of the Roman Republic. The church became a gravity center in the system of checks and balances on the imperial power. This system became known as, quote, symphony, end quote. It comes from the Greek word symphonia, which was a synonym of sanalia. Sanalia. These two words describe an intended partnership in sharing power between the church and state. As a partner of the empire in power sharing, the church received its share in privileges. Its clergymen were exempted from public services, munera, and some taxes. They also regularly received state subsidies. Their important legal privileges was to be judged by church courts. Bishops were endowed with the legal power to notarize slaves, manumission. They were also allowed to use imperial facilities such as post services for free. This helped them to attend church councils. Councils were costly. And because the state generously paid for them, the church was able to have many of them. Constantine and his successors sponsored copying and circulating the Jewish and Christian scriptures. This was also very expensive. They subsidized building magnificent basilicas. Constantine, for example, built from scratch vast worship complexes in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. His mother Helena personally supervised this work. The most magnificent construction project of the first millennium was accomplished by Justinian, who sponsored and personally supervised building the Cathedral of St. Sophia in Constantinople. And it talks about its legitimacy. It says the emperor's motivation to make the church participating in power sharing and provided it with privileges was not altruistic. So it was not altruistic, and they expected that the church in return would enhance their legitimacy. In the Roman Empire during both pre-Christian and Christian periods, there were no clear rules accepted by everyone in securing the succession of prayer. There were many ways to ascend the imperial throne and even more ways to fall from it. Most of these ways were not regulated by law, and their ascension to the throne and then keeping it. Emperors could rely more on legitimacy than legality, not so much the law as the reception by different constituencies secured power for individual rulers. They desperately needed support from army, aristocracy, and people to gain and stay in power. The mission of the church in creating and maintaining legitimacy for Christian emperors was therefore crucial. Neither pagan nor Christian Roman Empire was ever secular. It was always related to the divine in many ways. Divine was the main source of legitimacy for all Roman rulers, be they pagan or Christian. Those emperors were regarded as successful, who were believed to be endorsed with the Chinese call, quote, heavenly mandate, end quote. A Chinese traveler to Byzantium in the 7th century made a characteristic observation about how the Byzantines perceived the legitimacy of their rulers. He said, their kings are not men who last. They choose the most capable and they put him on the throne. But if a misfortune or something out of the ordinary happens in the empire, or if the wind or the rain arrive at the wrong season, then they at once depose the emperor and put another in his place. This source is New Book of Tang, page 198. And then such perception of legitimacy had deep roots in pre-Christian Roman statehood. Pagan Roman rulers were expected to make sure that, quote, peace with gods, end quote, pax deorum, translated to the well-being of the Roman people, solus populi Romani, and the peace across the Roman world, pax Romana, The same idea, somehow modified, survived in Christianity, where the emperor became the image of one God and a mediator between the heavenly and the earthly kingdoms of his subjects, felt that there was a harmony between heaven and earth. The emperor's legitimacy increased. This is the Christian empire inherited many pagan devices of securing the heavenly mandate for the emperors. One of them was the idea that emperors were exempted from the rest of the humankind and endowed with a special divine status. In the pagan times, emperors were proclaimed gods. In the Christian times, they were perceived as images of God in a way, which was different from how all human beings are the images of God. Pagan emperors often consulted oracles and stars about matters of state governance. Many Christian emperors retained astrology as their favorite way of knowing God's will. All these instruments of securing the heavenly mandate were secondary in comparison with what could be provided by the church. However, to use the legitimizing power of the church, the state had to share with the church some political power. It gives you some images here. You can see, like, this is an icon. Mary Celis, properly Romani, a Byzantine icon in the Roman Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore. Okay, nice looking icon. Got another one, some other one down here. In this section it goes over power sharing. And then over here, in this section is called Critiques of Symphony. And this part's called Policies of Intervention. It says, some emperors not only deprived the church of its share in power, but also imposed themselves on the church and interfered in its internal matters. The church hierarchs had invited them to such interference in the first place, as early as in the 270s. Bishops asked Emperor Aurelian, 270-5, to help them resolve an internal issue caused in Antioch by its bishop Paul Samosatian. Paul had preached an adoptionist Christology and was deposed by the Council of Antioch in 268. However, he refused to vacate the see, and the church reached out to the imperial help to get rid of him. The pagan emperor, however, kept distance and left it to the Christians to resolve their own issues. And so with the conversion of the Roman state to Christianity, emperors became more involved in the internal ecclesial issues, initially because of all the church's inability to solve them on its own. Soon after Constantine became the ruler of the West, he faced the problem of the Donatist schism, which had divided the church into Latin-speaking Africa and spread further throughout his dominion. He first gave the Bishop of Rome, Miltiades, a carte blanche to solve the problem, but was not satisfied with the results. And then Constantine took the matters into his own hands and convened a council in Arles in 314. This was the first church council ever called by an emperor. And then it goes on to say, Constantine intervened only when bishops too were insisting for him to step in or unable to solve their problems on their own. Even then, his main concern was not so much to side with a faction he believed to be orthodox, but to reconcile antagonist factions. In contrast to many bishops who wanted to protect orthodoxy, quote, by removing the diseased limb, end quote, Constantine, in the words of H.A. Drake, protected it, quote, by binding wounds, end quote. So, a book by Drake. I might have that book called Constantine and the Bishops, I think. Yes, I think I have a book called, by H.A. Drake. And then continuing. So such were his policies regarding the Arian crisis and the Nicene controversy that followed. Later emperors, in contrast to Constantine, perceived interventions to the church matters not as an exception but as a rule. They often intervene on their own initiative without being invited. Some of them tried to avoid siding with one of the arguing sides and promoted reconciliation. Others became partisan. It just talks about this page. Talks about at the end of the 4th century, Emperor Theodosius seemed to enjoy his role as an arbiter in matters of faith. He contributed to the theological debates not only as an emperor but also as an expert in theology. The laws of Theodosius promulgated are theologically richer than the church-related decrees of his predecessors. On the one hand, this demonstrates that theology as such became richer. On the other, the legalistic language of Theodosius' laws cannot conceal his fascination about theological debates. Let me give a quote here. Just going over just some of the problems they dealt with as well. Just very imbalanced, right? Like here, goes over Athanasius. This is when the empire interfered in the church matters, there were always those in the church who felt happy and those who resisted with the interference. Those objecting often perceived the intervention of the state as a violation of the established symphonic relationship between the church and the state. For example, the Archbishop of Alexandria, Athanasius, who was a protagonist of the Nicene faith, criticized the policies of Constantius II as both anti-Nicene and violating the rights of the church. Hilary of Poitiers and Lucifer of Caligari, in their invective treatises, blamed Constantius for the same. Athanasius and his Nicene confederates accused Constantius of violating the freedom of speech and the internal freedom of the church from the state. Athanasius argued that the only way of solving theological issues should be through persuasion, not coercion. It should be noted that Athanasius himself had been accused of coercive practices against the Meletians. I prefer not to mention this. Athanasius also did not mention the coercive promotion of the Nicene faith by Constantius' father Constantine. The Archbishop of Alexandria had personally experienced the Constantinian policies of coercion. Nevertheless, Athanasius rejected Constantius' intrusion to the matters of doctrine as a quote novel practice. What follows is his implicit critique of Constantius' attempts at revising the system of power sharing that had been established by Constantine. He gives this like long quote or so. It says the emperor summoned them, i.e. bishops, and ordered them to subscribe against Athanasius and be in communion with the heretics. When they were amazed at this novel practice and said that it was not an ecclesiastical canon, he immediately replied, quote, "Whatever I want, let that be deemed a canon. The so-called bishops of Syria allow me to speak in this way. Either obey or be exiled," end quote. On hearing these words, the bishops were utterly astonished. Stretching their hands up to God, they employed much freedom of speech towards him, i.e. Constantius, as well as arguments, teaching him that the kingdom was not his, but belonged to God, who had given it, and they told him to fear God because he might suddenly take it away. They threatened him with the day of judgment and told him not to corrupt ecclesiastical affairs, nor to involve the Roman Empire in the government of the church, nor to introduce the Arian heresy into the Church of God. But he neither listened nor allowed them to say anything else, but threatened them with even more barred his weapon against them and commanded that some of them be taken away. But like Pharaoh, he changed his mind yet again, so the holy men shook off the dust, looked up to God, and did not fear the emperor's threat or surrender when the sword had been unsheathed. Instead, they received exile as the performance of a service in their religious ministry. And it goes on to talk about this book, as Athanasius describes the protestations by the Nicene bishops as corresponding to the Constantinian model of power sharing. These bishops had their own opinion, which they openly and fearlessly communicated to the emperor. In contrast to them, Athanasius presents the non-Nicene bishops as encouraging the emperor to violate the healthy church-state partnership based on respect and consent. He says, this is another quote, It says, "The truth is proclaimed not with swords and javelins and soldiers, but by persuasion and advice." What sort of persuasion is it when there is fear of the emperor? Or what sort of advice where anyone who rejects it receives exile and death? When David was king and had his enemy in his power, and his soldiers wanted to kill this man, he prevented them not by his power, but as Scripture says, by persuading them with arguments and not allowing them to rise up and kill Saul. See Samuel, 1 Samuel 26. But this man, i.e. Constantius, has no arguments, and so he compels everyone through his power, revealing to all that their, i.e. the non-Nicene bishops, revealing to their wisdom is not in accordance with God, but is merely human, and that those who follow the beliefs of Arius truly have no king but Caesar. This is in Historia Arenarum 33-4. Flower, I guess it's also named Flower. And then this next section talks about Maximus. This is Maximus the Confessor. It says, 3 centuries after the clash between Athanasius and Constantius, another prominent theologian, Maximus the Confessor, criticized imperial authorities on the same matter. He accused these authorities of trespassing the red line beyond which the interference of the state to the matters of the church was unacceptable. He objected to the doctrines which later would become known as monoenergism and monotheletism. According to these doctrines, Christ has 2 natures, one activity, energeia, right, and one will. These doctrines continued the Neo-Chalcedonian project of Emperor Justinian and had the same political expedients to bridge the rapidly widening gap between Chalcedonian and anti-Chalcedonian Christians. Both monoenergism and monotheletism were conceived and promoted together by the church and state. They were initiated by Emperor Heraclius from 610 to 41. That's where he was, right? And endorsed by his symphonic partners, primarily the Patriarch of Constantinople, Sergius. And Heraclius promulgated the new doctrines by the imperial Achaesis in 638. Then 10 years later, in 648, Constans II, published another imperial decree, Typos. Both documents define which theological issues can be discussed and which must not. Maximus believed that by trying to censor theological discussions, imperial authorities trespassed and the demarcation line between the church and the state. And then he says this, no emperor was able to persuade the fathers who speak of God to be reconciled with the heretics of their times by means of equivocal expressions. Instead, they employed clear and authoritative expressions and ones that correspond to the teaching that was being inquired into, saying plainly that it is the mark of priests who make an inquiry and to define on the subject of the saving teachings of the Catholic Church. It says, Maximus made this statement at his trial for political disloyalty. The state's prosecutors then asked him a crucial question. Well then, isn't every Christian emperor also a priest, end quote? And Maximus said, no, he isn't, because he neither stands beside the altar and after the consecration of the bread elevates it with the words, quote, holy things for the holy, end quote. Nor does he baptize nor perform the rite of anointing, nor does he ordain and make bishops and presbyters and deacons, nor does he anoint churches, nor does he wear the symbols of the priesthood. The pallium and the gospel book, as he wears the symbols of imperial office, the crown and purple. Maximus thus responded to the tendency of his time, which culminated 2 generations later in iconoclasm. This was a tendency to concentrate in the imperial office all power, including the one previously allocated to the church. As a former high-rank imperial official, Maximus knew how important for both the state and the church is to uphold the system of checks and balances. He also advocated for the church to share in power. From this perspective, he was a republicanist. like a Republican, yeah. As a theologian, Maximus wanted to preserve the autonomy of the church from the state, from the imperial authorities of his time. However, both the system of checks and balances and the autonomy of the church infringed the sovereignty of the emperor. Infringed the sovereignty of the emperor. Maximus, as a result, was accused of treason and died in exile. And the next saint is talking about is John of Damascus. And then it talks about Photius and this other part, and this other section called monasticism. It talks about non-conformist movements. So it's very, very good book. It's pretty thick, right? And so I don't want the video to get too long, right? So if you like what I've read from it, right? This is what it looks like. It's from Cyril Haburan. I think he's Orthodox. Yeah, I think he's Orthodox. And so it has like one volume of all those topics and stuff. And so it's a pretty good book. I also found this other book, right? The Search for the Origins of Christian Worship by Paul Bradshaw, right? But it just mainly kind of calls into question the origins of like the Christian liturgical worship. Like it says, in this new edition of the classic work has been very largely rewritten in order to incorporate the fruits of the latest research and up-to-date bibliographical material. The new chapters have been added on ministry and ordination and on the effects of the coming of Christendom in the 4th century. And the search for the origins of Christian worship examines critically the sources of Christian liturgical practices in the first 3 centuries. It discusses how these practices should be interpreted to prevent projecting the customs of later times onto them. The book explores the considerable variety of practice in the early church and looks at the emergence of the classical shape of Christian theology, liturgy, as various traditions were brought together in the 4th century. And this is by Paul Bradshaw in this book. It has 10 chapters in the contents, right? Like the first chapter is about shifting scholarly perspectives. The second chapter is the background of early Christian worship. 3, worship in the New Testament. 4, ancient church orders, a continuing enigma. 5, other major liturgical sources. 6, the evolution of Eucharistic rites. 7, Christian initiation, a study in diversity. 8, liturgy and time. 9, ministry and ordination. 10, the effects of the coming of Christendom in the 4th century. Like here in the preface, he says it would perhaps be premature to say that a scholarly consensus is emerging, but certainly a growing number of us would now share the following conclusions. He lists 4 conclusions. The first one, he says that we know much less about the liturgical practices of the first 3 centuries of Christianity than we once thought that we did. A great deal more is shrouded in the mist of time than we formerly imagined, and many of our previous confident assertions about what the early church did now seem more like wishful thinking or the unconscious projections back into ancient times of later practices. And the second point, he says that what we do know about patterns of worship in the primitive period points towards considerable variety more often than towards rigid uniformity. Nowadays, when we talk about what the early church did, we need to specify where the practice in question is encountered. Syria, Egypt, North Africa, Rome, or some other region, and when, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, or 4th century, for each of these might be very different indeed from one another, and whether it is the only form found in that place at that time, for variant traditions could have coexisted alongside each other. And the third point, he says that the classical shape of Christian liturgy that we have so often described is to a very large degree the result of a deliberate assimilation of different Christian traditions to one another during the 4th century, rather than the survival of the one pattern of Christian worship from the earliest apostolic times, before perhaps even from Jesus himself. The fourth point, that what emerges in this post-Nicene era is frequently a liturgical compromise, a practice that includes a bit from here with a bit from there, modified by a custom from somewhere else, rather than the triumph of one way of doing things over all the others. Although this latter phenomenon is not unknown in some instances, this means that what then becomes the mainstream liturgical tradition of the Church in East and West is often quite unlike what any single Christian group was doing prior to the 4th century. A real mutation had taken place at that time, and many primitive customs had either disappeared or had been greatly altered from their former appearance. And he talks about how the rest of this book will thus try to trace the history of scholarship that was led up to the adoption of these conclusions, and to show what impact they are having on our understanding of various aspects of early Christian worship. As in the first edition, the whole volume may be seen as an annotated bibliography of primary and secondary literature pertaining to Christian worship in the first 4 centuries, and hence no separate bibliography is provided at the end, but readers should easily be able to locate the sources relevant to their interests by use of the indices, as full bibliographical details are given in the notes at the first mention of a text or study. He just talks about, he just gives his thanks to his colleagues and all these other places. So it was pretty interesting because I found it just trying to understand, like, what were the how different liturgical worship was from the Jewish worship, right? Yeah, if anything had changed. So this book looks like it goes over it, right? Because I haven't read it yet. I got it a week ago, less than a week ago, right? So in this section it says, did the Eucharist ever conform to the shape of the Last Supper? This is in the part worship in the New Testament. It says, at this point it seems worth asking the question as to whether the Eucharist ever conformed to the pattern presented in the New Testament narratives of the Last Supper, in which the bread and cup rituals were separated by the meal. It must be remembered that we possess no evidence at all for such a practice. It says it is simply inferred from the narratives, but that is to assume that the narratives once functioned as the detailed script or ordo for the community celebration, and not simply as aetiological stories, and that may be a mistake. So I'm tired. Here in the evolution of Eucharistic rites, it says, with the notable exception of Brian Spinks, even the few scholars who have acknowledged the possibility of fluidity in Jewish prayer patterns in the first century have still tended to see the Birkat HaMazon as the starting point for comparison. Furthermore, no one in the last 50 years seems to have seriously questioned whether Jewish patterns of praying would have predominated at Gentile Christian Eucharistic meals. Jewish prayer is certainly one significant influence on Christian Eucharistic practices, but not the only one. The secondary major obstacle to seeing their picture clearly has been the general desire, to which Spinks has again been one of the few exceptions, to situate all extant examples of later Christian rites and prayers within a single line of development. Not only has this involved an unnatural forcing of the facts to fit the theory, whether that has been in terms of trying to find a universal bipartite structure or of Eucharistic prayer, as in the case of Gerardo, or a tripartite shape of the prayer, as in the case of Maza, or in some other way, but it has usually resulted in giving attention only to material which conforms, broadly speaking, to that which later became standard in the mainstream Christian tradition, and in excluding from consideration all indications of practices that have a very different appearance, especially if they are known to us solely from the sources that appear to reflect less conventional forms of early Christianity, such as Syrian apocryphal texts, but to pick from the debris of history only those pieces that fit our preconceived pattern, and to ignore those that do not is to distort the picture. It may well be true that it is the pieces which most closely resemble the latter forms that are the best able to explain where those particular shapes came from, but they do not necessarily tell the whole story, nor do they accurately portray the situation of the early centuries. And this page says, but to assume that Eucharistic traditions everywhere were marching in step and exhibiting similar characteristics and changes at roughly the same time as each other seems unwarranted in itself. He's talking about these. He's talking about the Didache 9 through 10 has either been forced to fit somehow into the single trajectory, or rejected from consideration altogether on the grounds that what it describes is not a Eucharist, defended by the circular argument that it cannot be one because it does not fit into the pattern. Similarly, the anaphora of the apostolic tradition has tended to be treated as an example of the stage of evolution that all Eucharistic prayers had reached by the beginning of the 3rd century, and consequently any more primitive types, for example, those lacking a narrative of institution and anamnesis section, often regarded as belonging to the 2nd century or even earlier. And so, but to assume that the Eucharistic traditions everywhere were marching in step and exhibiting similar characteristics and changes at roughly the same time as each other seems unwarranted in itself, and to use this particular text as a fixed marker of progress even more so, in the light of the doubts that have been raised about its date and provenance, moreover, like other parts of the apostolic tradition, it seems to have undergone expansion in the course of time, especially with regard to the institution, narrative, anamnesis, and epiclesis. And it talks about next paragraph talks about their obstacle that may well have sent us on a wild goose chase has been the unquestioned assumption that an early Christian community's Eucharistic prayer, whether in written form or orally transmitted, would always have been a single, flowing, seamless whole. This is here, Matha has done us a great service by reminding us that Jewish prayers were composed of short individual units which might be combined together, and that there are signs of similar patterns in early Christianity. If this was more widespread than we have previously supposed, an early Eucharistic prayer was at first commonly in the form of a number of small, discrete prayer units. Then the short acclamations and or invocations which make up Eucharistic-type prayers in the apocryphal scriptures, which we have usually ignored as peripheral to the tradition, may after all not be far from the forms practiced by many Christians in at least the first 2 centuries, and the various communal acclamations that we find emerging at a number of points within later Eastern Eucharistic prayers, and especially Amen, in connection with the narrative of institution. So it may not have been completely new creations at the time, but simply the continuation and development of a practice which we find as early as the Didache, of punctuating the Eucharistic praying with an Amen response at the end of each individual prayer unit, rather than just at the conclusion of the whole oration. The fact that there is only limited documentary evidence of this in texts of the intervening period does not count against the theory, since those who wrote down those prayers would have felt no particular need to remind themselves in the text where they expected the congregation to make a response. So anyway, I want to stop there. This is first a very interesting book as well. It's called The Search of the Origins. It's a search for the for the origins of Christian worship. Sources and methods for the study of early liturgy by Paul F. Bradshaw. I guess I have to read these other books that I bought a while back, called Liturgy and Byzantinization in Jerusalem by Daniel Galadza. Yeah, sorry if I mispronounced it. Just like this one. So I just have to read that one. I did read the majority of this one. I got this one a while back. I read a little bit from it in the video. The Liturgical Past in Byzantium and Early Rus by Sean Griffin. So it's like read large proportions of it. This goes over a lot of liturgical mythology. Ecclesiam reinvents itself, right? Its history, which can, again, they said it can be ahistorical, right? Ahistorical, not rooted in historical facts, but in mythical liturgical storytelling, right? Or something like that. But anyway, I just want to read from the 2 books. The Search for the Origins of the Christian Worship and Eastern Christianity in its texts by Cyril Hoveron. And the other one was from Paul Bradshaw. So if you like those books, you can pick them up. And if you like my videos, please like and subscribe. Thank you, and God bless.